In the early months of 2022, Winnipeg was a city like any other, but beneath its ordinary streets and neighborhoods, a darkness was about to emerge. Jeremy Skibicki, a man in his late 30s, lived quietly in an apartment building in the North Kildonan area. To neighbors, he appeared unremarkable, reserved, keeping to himself, blending into the daily rhythm of the city. Few suspected that behind closed doors, a dangerous pattern was forming, targeting some of the most vulnerable members of the community. The first warning signs were subtle, almost invisible. Women who relied on shelters and transitional housing reported encounters with a man who seemed overly persistent and inappropriate, though nothing concrete was reported to the police at the time. These early interactions would later be understood as part of a calculated pattern, a chilling prelude to what would become a series of murders. By May of 2022, the consequences of his actions became horrifyingly clear. On May 15th, a scavenger at a residential site in North Kildonan discovered human remains in a garbage bin. The scene was immediately secured by the Winnipeg Police Service, who recognized the situation as a serious homicide. This initial discovery would mark the beginning of one of the most complex investigations in the city's recent history. Police quickly identified the remains as those of Rebecca Comtois, a young woman of 24 and a member of the Ocee-Chocosipi First Nation. Her disappearance had gone unreported for several days, and the community was shocked and grieving. Investigators began to piece together the last known movements of Rebecca, retracing her steps from local shelters and community centers, and noting her interactions in the days before her death. Officers also began reviewing video surveillance and witness reports around the North Kildonan area, looking for any clue that could lead to her killer. It became evident that the man responsible had carefully planned his actions, exploiting the routines and vulnerabilities of his victims. For police, the case was not just a murder investigation. It was the potential start of identifying a serial offender operating in the city. Community members and Indigenous leaders quickly rallied, providing support to law enforcement and raising awareness about the dangers faced by vulnerable women. They also emphasized the ongoing crisis of violence against Indigenous women in Winnipeg, noting that Rebecca's case was tragically part of a much larger pattern. The discovery sparked conversations about safety, systemic issues, and the urgent need for protective measures. Meanwhile, forensic teams meticulously examined the crime scene. Evidence recovered at the bin and surrounding areas provided initial clues, including items that could be linked to the suspect, though nothing definitive yet connected a person to the crime. Investigators worked tirelessly, understanding that speed and accuracy were critical to prevent further tragedy. Following the discovery of Rebecca Comtois' remains, investigators began building a clearer picture of the victims targeted by Jeremy Skibicki. It became evident that he preyed specifically on Indigenous women living in vulnerable circumstances, many of whom were connected to shelters or transitional housing in Winnipeg. These women were not just statistics. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends with rich, full lives tragically cut short. Rebecca Comtois, aged 24, was a devoted mother with a young daughter. She had grown up as a member of the Ocee-Chocosipi First Nation and was known in her community for her kindness and resilience. Family members described her death as a devastating loss, one that left a void impossible to fill. Her life, like those of the other victims, was a reminder of the personal and human toll behind the headlines. Morgan Harris, aged 39, was another of Skibicki's victims. A mother of 5 and grandmother of 1, she was from the Long Plain First Nation. Her family described her as fun-loving, fearless, and full of life, someone who brought joy to everyone around her. Morgan often faced challenges, but her resilience and warmth made her beloved by those who knew her. Her sudden death shocked both family and community members, highlighting the vulnerability of women in her position. Mercedes Myron, aged 26, was also from the Long Plain First Nation and a mother of 2 children. Friends and family remembered her as strong, nurturing, and fiercely protective of her loved ones. In the weeks before her death, She had been sharing hopes and plans for her future, moments that would now remain frozen in time. Her loss was a profound blow to her family, leaving behind grief that would never fully heal. The fourth victim remained unidentified for some time. Indigenous leaders referred to her as Mashkode Bijikiikwe, or Buffalo Woman, as a way to honor her memory and give her a place in the community. She was later identified in March of 2025 as Ashley Shingoose from St. Teresa Point, Anishinaabe Nation. Like the other victims, Ashley had a life, connections, and a story that ended far too early. All four women shared circumstances that made them particularly vulnerable. They relied on support services such as shelters, food programs, and community assistance. This reliance, tragically, made them targets for Skibicki, who exploited their situations with calculated precision. Investigators noted that his pattern focused on women who were socially marginalized, emphasizing the predatory nature of his crimes. Family members and community leaders played an important role during this period, working with law enforcement to ensure the stories of the victims were not forgotten. Each woman's identity, culture, and history were recognized publicly, underscoring the human aspect of the investigation. The community's involvement also helped police piece together the victims' routines, contacts, and last known movements, forming a critical part of the investigation. After identifying the victims, Winnipeg police launched an extensive investigation to track down the perpetrator. Early evidence pointed to the possibility that the killer had a detailed knowledge of his victims' routines and the city's systems for garbage collection and disposal. Investigators began mapping each victim's last known movements, shelter visits, and contacts, hoping to find a connection that could lead to a suspect. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings and public spaces was collected, reviewed, and cross-referenced with shelter records, marking the beginning of an intense and meticulous process. By mid-May of 2022, police had identified a 37-year-old man named Jeremy Skibicki as a person of interest. He lived in an apartment building near where some of Rebecca Contois' remains were found. Officers noted that his residence matched certain patterns in the crime, including proximity to trash disposal routes and shelters frequented by the victims. A search warrant was executed on May 18, 2022, after which Skibicki was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Rebecca Contois. During interrogation, Skibicki's behavior was unexpectedly cooperative, yet chilling. Within hours, he admitted to killing 3 additional women whose deaths police were not yet aware of. He described targeting women who were homeless or transient, luring them to his apartment, and then committing the murders. Investigators quickly verified his account by matching DNA evidence from his apartment and personal belongings to the victims. Items such as clothing, knives, and personal effects linked him directly to Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and Ashley Shingoose. The investigation revealed the timeline of the murders. Ashley Shingoose was killed around March 15th, 2022, followed by Morgan Harris on or about May 1st, and Mercedes Myron on or about May 4th. Rebecca Contois' murder occurred on or around May 14th, 2022. Skibicki explained how he had timed the disposal of bodies to coincide with local garbage collection schedules. Police determined that the remains of Harris and Myron were dumped in dumpsters that led to the Prairie Green landfill north of Winnipeg, while Rebecca Contois' remains were located both in a nearby dumpster and later at the Brady Road landfill. Officers also discovered that Skibicki had used online sales platforms to dispose of items connected to Ashley Shingoose, including a reversible jacket, which provided further evidence linking him to her death. The use of modern technology in combination with meticulous crime scene processing highlighted the investigative complexity of the case. Police worked with forensic experts to process each item, collecting DNA, fingerprints, and trace evidence to build a clear chain of connection. Throughout May and June of 2022, detectives conducted extensive interviews with shelter staff, friends, and acquaintances of the victims. They gathered details about who may have been in contact with the women in the weeks leading up to their deaths. Despite initial challenges, cooperation from community organizations eventually helped corroborate Skibicki's confession and establish timelines for each victim. The thoroughness of these interviews was critical in creating an airtight case for the Crown prosecutors. The investigation also examined Skibicki's past. Police discovered a documented history of violence, including prior incidents involving former partners. Social media activity painted a picture of deeply troubling beliefs, including racial hatred and disturbing views of women. Investigators noted that while he had no prior convictions for murder, the pattern of behavior suggested a highly organized and methodical individual. Jeremy Skibicki's arrest prompted a deeper examination of who he was and what motivated his crimes. Investigators and psychologists alike tried to understand how a seemingly ordinary man living in a Winnipeg apartment could commit such calculated and horrific acts. Skibicki had a documented history of violence, particularly against Indigenous women he had known personally, which indicated a long-standing pattern of abuse and prejudice. Police and forensic experts reviewed his online activity, noting a disturbing fixation on racist ideologies, misogyny, and violent content, which helped explain his targeting of vulnerable women. During court proceedings, Skibicki claimed that he believed he was acting on a divine mission, a statement examined carefully by mental health professionals. The defense presented a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, arguing that delusions had driven him to commit the murders. However, the Crown's experts, including Dr. Gary Chamowitz, disagreed, providing evidence that Skibicki was not psychotic at the time of the killings. Instead, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and substance abuse issues, combined with a highly disturbing paraphilic fixation. This diagnosis indicated that his actions were deliberate and premeditated, not the result of a temporary mental breakdown. Investigators also looked into Skibicki's personal relationships. He had lived alone for years, but police discovered he had previously been involved with women who shared similarities with his victims, often Indigenous women. These patterns, along with his online activity and history of controlling behavior, suggested that he had been grooming his environment and exploiting vulnerabilities long before the killings in 2022. His apartment became a central piece of evidence, containing objects and items directly linked to each of the victims. Forensic teams cataloged these items meticulously, ensuring that each piece would support the prosecution's case. Psychologists later testified that Skibicki's personality traits included a lack of empathy, impulsivity, and manipulative behavior. Combined with his obsession with control and dominance, these traits painted a portrait of a person capable of meticulously planning violent acts without remorse. While some reports referred to him as calm and even polite in everyday interactions, those closest to him noted a hidden intensity and volatile nature. The stark contrast between his public demeanor and private behavior made him especially dangerous. The prosecution emphasized how Skibicki selected his victims based on both opportunity and prejudice. Each woman was living in a vulnerable situation, often relying on shelters or temporary housing, which Skibicki exploited. He targeted them with precision, luring them into situations where he had complete control. His detailed knowledge of their routines and the city's disposal system allowed him to act with an alarming efficiency, highlighting the premeditated nature of his crimes. Experts also explored the social and systemic factors that allowed Skibicki to operate undetected for a period of time. Indigenous women in Winnipeg often face heightened risks due to socioeconomic disparities, systemic neglect, and barriers to accessing help. Skibicki's crimes brought national attention to these issues, prompting discussions about the need for increased protection, support, and awareness for vulnerable populations. In examining his motivations, investigators and court experts concluded that Skibicki's actions were a combination of deeply ingrained prejudice, a sense of superiority, and a compulsive need to dominate. Unlike other crimes of passion, these killings were executed with a methodical and chilling logic. Understanding his mindset became critical, not only for the trial, but also for broader law enforcement strategies aimed at preventing similar tragedies in the future. After months of meticulous investigation, the legal proceedings against Jeremy Skibicki finally began in May of 2024. The trial was held in Winnipeg and drew national attention due to the severity of his crimes and the broader implications regarding the safety of Indigenous women. Prosecutors presented an extensive body of evidence, including DNA links, digital footprints, and forensic analysis from his apartment. Each piece of evidence was carefully detailed to the jury, establishing a clear timeline of the murders of Rebecca Comtois, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Marin, and Ashley Shingoose. The prosecution emphasized that Skibicki had acted methodically, preying on vulnerable women while exploiting systemic weaknesses in social services and law enforcement oversight. During the trial, expert testimony played a crucial role in explaining Skibicki's psychological profile. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Gary Chimowitz testified that Skibicki exhibited antisocial personality traits, substance abuse issues, and a paraphilic fixation that contributed to the killings. The defense argued that he was not criminally responsible due to mental illness, specifically paranoid schizophrenia, but the Crown's evidence refuted this claim. Chimowitz's findings, supported by other experts, made it clear that Skibicki was fully aware of his actions and their consequences, reinforcing the argument for premeditation. On July 11th, 2024, the verdict was delivered. Chief Justice Glenn Joyal found Jeremy Skibicki guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge described the murders as mercilessly calculated and highlighted Skibicki's extremist views and deliberate targeting of Indigenous women. Skibicki, who remained largely emotionless throughout the trial, was sentenced to 4 concurrent life sentences, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The sentence ensured that he would not be eligible for release until he was 60 years old, providing the victims' families with a measure of justice for the first time. Following the verdict, attention shifted to the recovery of the victims' remains, a process that had been delayed for months due to limited resources and the locations of the landfills. In December of 2024, the Prairie Green landfill search began in earnest, and by March of 2025, the remains of Morgan Harris were positively identified. Later that same month, Mercedes Marin's remains were located and confirmed. These discoveries, while devastating, provided long-awaited closure for the families, allowing them to conduct proper memorials and funerals for their loved ones. The search for Ashley Shingoose's remains at the Brady Road landfill began in August of 2025, reflecting a continued commitment to honoring the victims and ensuring that no detail of the case was left unresolved. The aftermath of the trial also sparked wider public and governmental attention. Indigenous leaders and advocacy groups pushed for stronger protective measures for vulnerable populations, especially women living in precarious situations. Programs were reviewed to improve safety in shelters, address systemic discrimination, and increase collaboration between law enforcement agencies and social services. Skibicki's case became a focal point in discussions about preventing similar crimes, highlighting the need for awareness, education, and structural reform. Families of the victims expressed a mixture of relief and sorrow. While the verdict confirmed that the killer was behind bars, it could not undo the trauma endured by the victims' loved ones. Relatives described feeling a sense of validation and recognition after years of unanswered questions, but also the enduring grief of losing their mothers, daughters, and sisters. Their advocacy for justice continued, emphasizing that the case should serve as a reminder of the importance of protecting marginalized communities. In the broader context, the Skibicki case became emblematic of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis in Canada. It underscored how systemic neglect, vulnerability, and unchecked prejudices can intersect, allowing predators to commit horrific acts with relative impunity. Law enforcement agencies used the lessons learned to develop strategies for better identification of at-risk individuals and improve protocols for investigating violent crimes, targeting Indigenous women. With Jeremy Skibicki convicted and serving 4 concurrent life sentences, the story of the 2022 Winnipeg serial killings moved from the courtroom to the wider community, highlighting the profound social and cultural consequences of his crimes. The murders of Rebecca Contois, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and Ashley Shingoose sent shockwaves across Manitoba and the entire country. Indigenous leaders emphasized that while one predator had been stopped, the broader crisis of violence against Indigenous women and girls remained urgent and unresolved. Advocates used the case to push for sustained government funding, policy reform, and community-led initiatives aimed at protecting vulnerable women and addressing systemic inequalities. The recovery of the victims' remains, completed gradually through the searches at Prairie Green Landfill and Brady Road Landfill, allowed families to conduct memorials and properly grieve. These ceremonies were both private and public, reflecting a blend of cultural practices and communal mourning. The community came together to honor the victims, emphasizing their lives, relationships, and legacies, rather than focusing solely on the horrific circumstances of their deaths. Each memorial became a symbolic reminder that these women were loved, valued, and deserving of recognition. The legal and investigative outcomes also prompted Winnipeg Police and Manitoba RCMP to reevaluate procedures for identifying and protecting at-risk populations. Changes included improved tracking of missing persons reports, enhanced communication with Indigenous communities, and better interagency cooperation to prevent individuals like Skibicki from targeting vulnerable people unchecked. Officers involved in the investigation reflected on lessons learned, acknowledging the importance of early intervention and culturally sensitive approaches in cold case investigations. On a societal level, the case ignited discussions about the intersection of racism, misogyny, and social neglect. Media coverage and public discourse highlighted the specific risks faced by Indigenous women, especially those experiencing homelessness or relying on shelters. Advocates stressed the need for culturally informed support systems, including mental health resources, secure housing, and community programs. The Skibicki case became a teaching point in law enforcement training, emphasizing the critical need to listen to marginalized communities and to act proactively when warning signs appear. Families of the victims, while experiencing a measure of closure through the conviction, continued to navigate their grief and trauma. They became vocal advocates for systemic change, attending public forums, speaking with policymakers, and participating in initiatives aimed at reducing the risk of similar tragedies. Their voices reinforced that justice is not only about punishing perpetrators, but also about protecting communities, empowering survivors, and preventing future crimes. Nationally, the 2022 Winnipeg serial killings contributed to renewed attention on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, reinforcing the urgent need for concrete actions and accountability. The case illustrated how systemic failures, ranging from gaps in social services to delays in law enforcement response, can compound the vulnerability of marginalized populations. It also highlighted the resilience and determination of families and communities advocating for safety, recognition, and justice. Even years after the events, the legacy of this case remains potent. Memorials, educational programs, and public awareness campaigns ensure that the stories of Rebecca, Morgan, Mercedes, and Ashley are remembered beyond headlines. Their names are now part of a broader movement demanding equity, safety, and dignity for Indigenous women across Canada. The Skibicki case, while uniquely horrifying, became a catalyst for societal reflection, advocacy, and ongoing reform, leaving a lasting imprint on Winnipeg and the nation.